I never thought a simple flyer at the local community center would lead to the most harrowing, life-altering night of my entire existence. But looking back at the blood on my kitchen floor and the silent, heavy weight of the secret I'm now forced to carry, I realize I was never just a babysitter. I was a witness to a crime that should have stayed buried in the dark. How far would you go to protect a child who isn't yours when you realize their own parents are the monsters hiding under the bed? And would you risk your own freedom to make sure justice was served in the most brutal way possible? Tell me, honestly, if you found what I found in that locked nursery, would you have called the police? Or would you have taken matters into your own hands like I did? This wasn't just the toughest job of my life. It was a descent into a nightmare that I'm still trying to wake up from. And I need you to hear every single detail so you can tell me if I'm the hero or the villain in this story. It all started on a Tuesday when I received a call from a woman named Elena, who sounded like she was perpetually on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She told me she had seen my ad and was desperate for a last-minute sitter for her 6-year-old son, Toby, because her regular nanny had quit without notice. A red flag I should have seen from a mile away. The pay she offered was triple my usual rate, which at the time felt like a blessing since I was struggling to keep up with my rent. But looking back, that money was nothing more than hush money in disguise. When I pulled up to their estate, it was one of those massive, cold, modern fortresses with floor-to-ceiling glass windows that somehow felt like they were watching you back. Elena met me at the door, looking impeccable but hollow, her eyes darting toward the stairs every time a floorboard creaked. She gave me a brief tour of the house, which felt more like a museum than a home, and introduced me to Toby, a pale, silent boy who didn't look up from his drawing once. Her husband, Richard, was a high-powered attorney who barely acknowledged my presence, radiating an aura of cold authority that made the hair on my arms stand up. They were heading to a high-society gala, and told me they'd be back by midnight, leaving me with a list of strict rules that included never entering the basement, and making sure Toby stayed in his room after 8 p.m. no matter what noises I heard. Elena's hand had trembled as she handed me the emergency contact list, but she pointedly omitted any local neighbors, claiming they were private people who didn't mix with the locals. As I walked deeper into the house, I noticed the walls were lined with expensive, unsettling art. Abstract pieces that looked like twisted limbs and silent screams, which only added to the suffocating atmosphere. Toby's room was at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway, and as I walked him up, I noticed that the door handles on the other rooms had been removed, leaving only smooth, circular holes where the locks should be. It felt less like a family home, and more like a high-end detention center designed to keep things in just as much as it kept people out. I tried to make small talk with Toby, asking about his school or his favorite toys, but he just stared at his sneakers, his breathing shallow and quick. The air in his room felt thin, as if the house itself was sucking the oxygen out of the room to feed some hidden beast in the walls. I sat on the edge of his bed, trying to project a sense of calm I didn't feel, while my mind raced with questions about why a 6-year-old would be living in such a sterile, joyless environment. Every time I tried to smile, Toby would look behind me, his eyes widening as if he expected someone to be standing in the doorway with a finger to their lips. It was a level of fear no child should ever know, and I felt a protective instinct flare up in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel for a stranger's child. I noticed a small, hidden camera in the corner of his ceiling, its tiny red light blinking like a malevolent eye, and I realized that every second of Toby's life was being scrutinized. I began to wonder if the nanny, who quit, had actually seen the same thing I was seeing, or if she had tried to intervene and suffered the consequences. The mansion felt like it was breathing, the central air conditioning humming with a low, vibrating frequency that made my teeth ache. I tried to distract Toby with a game of hide and seek, but he refused to leave the center of the rug, whispering that the Batman could see through the floor. I felt a knot of anger tighten in my stomach at the thought of what this child had been subjected to in the name of a strict upbringing. As the heavy front door clicked shut, the silence of the house became deafening, and I tried to strike up a conversation with Toby to ease the tension. He was drawing circles over and over again with a black crayon, his small hands trembling slightly. When I asked him what he wanted for dinner, he finally looked at me with eyes that seemed far too old for a 6-year-old and whispered, "Don't let the Batman come up." I felt a chill run down my spine and asked him who the Batman was, but he just went back to his circles, refusing to say another word. I made him some mac and cheese, which he barely touched. And as the sun began to set, the house transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and strange echoes. I tried to distract myself with a book, but every time the wind hit the glass, I jumped. The house began to groan, the way old wood does, but there were other sounds too, metallic scrapes and a low hum that sounded like industrial machinery operating deep beneath my feet. I checked the kitchen pantry for a snack, but found it stocked with strange, unlabeled canisters and medical-grade supplies that had no business being in a family kitchen. My heart was already racing, and I found myself checking the locks on the front door every 10 minutes, terrified that the bad man was already inside. I went back to check on Toby, and I found him hiding under his bed, clutching a small, worn-out teddy bear that looked like the only thing he actually loved in that house. I whispered to him that he was safe, but the look he gave me told me he knew better than I did. Around 8:30 p.m., after I had tucked Toby back into bed, I heard the first sound, a muffled, rhythmic thudding coming from beneath the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of a settling house. It was the sound of something, or someone, hitting a wall. I remembered the rule about the basement, but my curiosity and a growing sense of dread overrode my professional boundaries. I walked toward the basement door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and noticed that the keypad lock wasn't fully engaged. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a stairwell that seemed to descend into a bottomless pit of darkness. I stood at the top for what felt like hours, listening to the thudding grow louder and more desperate. It was a human sound, the sound of a fist against wood, a plea for help that bypassed my brain and went straight to my gut. I started to descend, my footsteps echoing against the concrete, and the air began to smell of ozone and antiseptic. The walls were lined with copper piping that didn't seem to lead to any plumbing, and the further down I went, the more the temperature dropped. I reached a landing and saw a row of heavy, reinforced crates, each labeled with a series of alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to me. But the thudding was coming from behind a heavy steel door at the very end of the hall. The door had no handle, only a small slit for food and a high-security electronic bolt. The air grew colder as I descended the stairs, the smell of damp earth and something metallic filling my nose. At the bottom, I found a room that looked like a makeshift medical suite, filled with filing cabinets and a heavy, locked steel door. The walls were covered in soundproofing foam, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whimpering coming from behind the steel. I found a desk with a ledger on it, and as I flipped through the pages, I saw names, dates, and blood types, dozens of them, all written in Richard's precise, legalistic handwriting. It looked like a logbook for a human warehouse. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip my phone flashlight, but I pushed forward, driven by a gut feeling that something was horribly wrong. Through a small reinforced glass window in the door, I saw her, a young woman, looking no older than 20, huddled in the corner of a padded cell. She looked up at the light, her face bruised and her eyes wide with a mix of terror and a desperate, flickering hope. She pressed her palms against the glass, her lips moving silently, begging for a way out. In that moment, I realized that Richard and Elena weren't just cold socialites. They were captors. I realized that the bad man Toby was afraid of wasn't a ghost. It was his own father, and the nanny, who quit probably hadn't quit at all. She had likely become another entry in that horrifying ledger. I looked around the room and saw a tray of surgical instruments, laid out with terrifying precision, and a row of monitors displaying heart rates and oxygen levels. This wasn't a basement. It was a private infirmary for something unspeakable. I saw a photo pinned to the wall, a picture of Richard shaking hands with a high-ranking politician, both of them smiling in front of this very house. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just one family's secret. It was a network. My first instinct was to run, to get Toby and scream for help, but then I heard the garage door opening upstairs. They were home early. I scrambled back up the stairs, my mind racing a million miles an hour, and barely managed to sit back down on the sofa before Richard walked into the living room, his eyes scanning the area with a predatory sharpness. He stood there for a moment, sniffing the air like an animal, and I realized I had left the basement door slightly ajar. He knew. I could see it in the way he looked at the basement door and then back at me. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there peeling off his leather gloves while Elena lingered in the shadows behind him, looking terrified. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Elena's eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked at me with a mixture of pity and malice that made my stomach turn. I tried to act natural, complaining about a headache and saying I should probably head out, but Richard stepped between me and the front door, a cold smile spreading across his face. He told me that I was a very curious girl, and that curiosity usually came with a very high price. He started talking about how some people are meant to lead and others are meant to serve, and how they had gone to great lengths to preserve their family's legacy. He explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that they were part of an elite cleansing program, and the girl downstairs was merely a vessel for their needs. He walked toward me, his shadow stretching across the floor like a giant claw, and he began to describe the legal loopholes he had created to ensure that people like the girl downstairs legally didn't exist. He talked about his connections in the DA's office and how any report I made would be buried before it even reached a desk. It was clear that the woman downstairs was part of some twisted experiment or a surrogate they were keeping against her will. I realized then that I wasn't going to be allowed to leave that house alive if I didn't play my cards perfectly. Richard began to describe exactly what he was going to do to me, his voice calm as if he were discussing a business contract. And I saw Elena nod along, a hollow shell of a woman who had clearly surrendered her soul to his madness long ago. She looked at me and whispered, "It's better if you don't fight, dear. It only makes him angry." That was the moment I realized that there was no mercy to be found in either of them. They were both fully committed to the horror they had built. So that's the horrific situation I was in, trapped in a mansion with two monsters, a terrified child upstairs, and a woman dying in the basement. I had to make a choice between playing the victim or becoming the hunter. Before I tell you how I turned the tables on them and the absolute carnage that followed, I want you to pause right now and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have tried to talk your way out? Or would you have fought back with everything you had? I'm reading all the comments, so let me know. Richard began to move toward me, his hand reaching for something in his inner coat pocket, and I knew I only had one chance. I grabbed the heavy glass decanter from the side table and swung it with every ounce of strength I had, catching him right in the temple. He went down hard, the glass shattering and expensive scotch splashing everywhere. Elena screamed, a high-pitched, jagged sound, and lunged at me, but I was fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I pushed her back, her heels slipping on the wet floor, and I ran for the kitchen. I grabbed the largest chef's knife from the block, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't run for the front door, I ran back to the basement. I knew if I left that woman there, she was dead. I used Richard's keys, which I'd snatched from the floor, to unlock the steel door. The woman, whose name I later learned was Mia, stumbled out, her legs barely able to support her. We scrambled back upstairs just as Richard was starting to groan and sit up, blood streaming down his face. The kitchen was a mess of broken glass and spilled liquor, and the air was thick with the smell of copper. Richard was fueled by a dark, manic energy now, his sophisticated facade completely stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. He found a decorative fireplace poker and swung it wildly, smashing the expensive furniture as he chased us into the foyer. Mia was sobbing, but I kept my grip on her arm, dragging her toward the stairs. I needed to get Toby. I could hear Richard's heavy boots hitting the marble behind us, his voice a low, guttural growl promising that he would take his time with me once he caught us. We reached the second-floor landing, and I could see the light from Toby's room. I pushed Mia inside and told her to lock the door while I faced him. I stood at the top of the stairs, the knife held tight in my hand, watching as he climbed. He looked less like a lawyer and more like a wounded beast, his expensive suit soaked in blood and his eyes clouded with a murderous haze. He lunged, and the poker whistled past my ear, shattering a picture frame on the wall. I dodged and kicked him in the chest, sending him stumbling back against the railing. We reached the top of the stairs just as Richard started to climb, his eyes fixed on me with a promise of unimaginable pain. I pushed a heavy mahogany dresser down the stairs, and it crashed into him, sending him tumbling back down to the first floor. Elena was at the bottom, screaming for him to get up, her loyalty to her monster of a husband outweighing any shred of humanity she had left. We reached Toby's room, and I found him curled in a ball, his hands over his ears. I scooped him up, and with Mia leaning on my shoulder, we looked for another way out. Every window in the upper floor was reinforced with steel bars, an obvious detail I had missed in the dark. We were cornered. I turned back to the hallway and saw Richard coming again, his face a mask of gore and fury. He was holding a handgun now, and he fired a shot that shattered the vase next to my head. I pulled Toby and Mia into the master bedroom, slamming the heavy oak door and sliding the bolt home. I could hear Richard throwing his weight against the wood, the sound of the gun hitting the floor as he resorted to brute force. The door began to splinter, and I realized the only way out was through the balcony, but it was a 30-foot drop to a stone patio. I looked at Toby's terrified face and then at Mia, who was barely conscious, and I knew I had to end this here. I waited by the door, the knife held low. The next 10 minutes were a blur of violence and terror. Richard was a large man, and even dazed, he was dangerous. He intercepted us in the hallway, his face contorted into a mask of pure rage. He told me I was dead, that he would make sure I disappeared and no one would ever find a trace of me. But he underestimated one thing. A person who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. I didn't hesitate. As he lunged, I drove the knife into his shoulder, and as he recoiled, Mia grabbed a heavy bronze statue from a pedestal and brought it down on the back of his head. This time he didn't get up. His body slumped against the wall, sliding down to leave a thick, dark streak on the expensive wallpaper. Elena was curled in a ball in the corner, sobbing hysterically, realizing her world had just collapsed. I ran upstairs, grabbed a sleeping Toby, and carried him down, shielding his eyes from the sight of his father's body. We broke through the back glass doors and ran into the woods, the cold night air biting at our skin until we reached the main road and flagged down a passing motorist. The driver was a young man who looked terrified at the sight of us. 3 bloodied, shivering people emerging from the dark, but he had enough sense to call 911 immediately. I remember the blue and red lights reflecting off the trees, and the feeling of the cold pavement under my bare feet as the police swarmed the estate. The officers who entered the basement came out looking pale, some of them losing their lunch on the manicured lawn. The scale of what Richard had been doing was far beyond anything I could have imagined. They found tunnels connecting to neighboring properties, a literal hive of human trafficking and medical malpractice that involved some of the biggest names in the city. They found evidence of other women who hadn't been as lucky as Mia, their names recorded in the same ledger I had seen. The investigation revealed that Richard had been the architect of a harvesting operation that had been running for nearly a decade. The aftermath was a media circus. The police found enough evidence in that basement to send Elena away for life, though Richard never made it to trial. The blow to his head had been fatal. It turned out they had been part of an underground ring involving high-profile individuals, and my toughest job ended up exposing a network of horror that spanned the entire state. For months, I was hounded by reporters, and for a while there was talk of charging me with manslaughter, but the public outcry and the evidence of Mia's captivity made it clear that I had acted in self-defense. Toby was placed with a loving foster family, and I still visit him, though he doesn't remember much of that night, which is a mercy. He lives on a farm now, far away from the cold glass walls of that mansion, and for the first time he draws pictures of suns and trees instead of black circles. He once told me that he remembers me as the lady who turned on the lights. And that's enough for me. Mia is recovering in a specialized facility, and we speak every week. She's learning how to walk again, how to trust again, and how to live in a world that doesn't have bars on the windows. She still has nightmares, but she says that knowing Richard is gone helps her sleep. I lost my sense of safety that night, and I wake up screaming more often than I'd like to admit. But I don't regret a single thing I did. I learned that the people who look the most perfect on the outside often have the rotting skeletons in their closets, and sometimes, the only way to save a life is to be willing to ruin your own. The money Elena gave me is still sitting in a bank account. I can't bring myself to touch it. It feels like blood money. Instead, I've dedicated my time to volunteering at shelters for victims of trafficking, trying to balance the scales for the lives that Richard and his friends destroyed. I spent weeks in therapy trying to reconcile the person I was before that night with the person who held a knife in that hallway. My therapist tells me that I'm a survivor, but some days I feel like I'm just a ghost of the girl who walked into that mansion. I look at my hands and I don't see the college student anymore. I see the woman who had to kill to survive. I still look at the scars on my hands and remember the weight of that knife. A constant reminder that the world isn't as safe as we want to believe. This experience changed me in ways I can't even put into words, turning a broke college student into someone who knows exactly what she's capable of when pushed to the brink. I realized that morality isn't always black and white. Sometimes it's a bloody shade of gray. I've had to change my name and move to a different city to escape the lingering reach of Richard's associates. But I'd do it all again to see Toby smile the way he does now. If you think I did the right thing by fighting back and taking charge of that situation, please like this video to show your support. It helps me know that I'm not alone in my choices. If you want to hear more stories about people surviving the unthinkable and coming out the other side, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I have so many more stories to tell, and I want you there for every single one of them. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Do you think the mother deserved a harsher sentence, or was she just a victim of her husband too? I'll be down there responding to as many of you as I can. Stay safe out there, because you never truly know who you're working for. I'll see you all in the next story.